All right, so everyone, thank you again for joining us. Again, this is the webinar from the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University on Wahhabism in the World. And with us today, we have Peter Mandeville, who is a Berkeley Center Senior Research Fellow and a Brookings Institution Non-Resident Senior Fellow. He is also a Professor of International Affairs at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, where he also serves as Interim Director of the Ali Viral Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies. Previous government experience includes serving as a member of the US State Department's policy planning staff from 2011 to 2012, and as a senior advisor in the department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs from 2015 to 2016. He's also been a visiting senior fellow at the Pew Research Center. His research focuses on the comparative study of religious authority and social movements in the Muslim world, with an emphasis on youth groups, transnational networks, and new media. We're also very lucky to have with us today Alexander Thurston, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. He's the author of several books, including Salafism in Nigeria, Islam, Preaching and Politics from 2016, Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement from 2018, and Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups, published in 2020. He has held fellowships with the Council on Foreign Relations, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the American Council of Learned Societies. And I am Anel Sheline. I am a research fellow for the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a DC anti-militarism think tank. I'm also a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. My hopefully forthcoming book is under review at Oxford University Press. I look at the promotion of so-called moderate Islam as a messaging strategy that gained salience after 9/11, comparing the cases of Saudi Arabia, Oman, Morocco, and Jordan. So here I will go ahead and hand the microphone over to Peter, who can start to tell us a bit more about this great new volume he just edited and just is released from Oxford.
Great, thanks so much, Anel, and welcome to everyone joining us today. I'm so pleased that you're able to make some time to hear a little bit about this new book that just came out from Oxford University Press. I'm obviously thrilled to finally see it in print, having been working on it, or at least thinking about it, for the better part of 2 decades now. And so what I wanted to do briefly today is just to talk a little bit about the origins of the project that eventually led to the publication of the book. And then briefly touch on just some of the top line major cross-cutting findings that seem to emerge from the wide range of country case studies covered by the book. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have one of the country case study authors, Professor Alex Thurston, with us today to talk a little bit about at least one case study in some more detail. So where did the book come from? The origins of it lay in a set of discussions and debates about Saudi Arabia that I have been watching and monitoring and thinking about essentially during the entirety of my career. And very specifically, the debate about whether or not Saudi Arabia's petrodollar funded export of the very austere and highly conservative form of Islam, often called Wahhabism, around the world had a major impact on the way in which Muslims in settings across the globe think about, understand, and practice their religion. Now, this is a debate that, as many of you know, has been going on for a very long time. It's one that, in my experience, is often quite polarizing and politicized. Certainly when I first started paying attention to it, when I first came to Washington, D.C., what I would often experience is a sense of political opponents of Saudi Arabia articulating claims that Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism had had a highly distorting, damaging effect on Muslim societies around the world, and could be directly linked to, for example, the rise of extremism and terrorism. On the other end of the extreme, you had voices often affiliated with countries that tended to be, or interest groups that tended to be allies of Saudi Arabia, that went the other direction and sort of downplayed the impact. Essentially saying that, look, this is just the, circulation through publications of, more conservative understandings of religion, but, there's nothing inherently problematic about it. And my sense had always been that, as in with all these things, the truth of the matter was really located in various murkier shades of gray, somewhere in the middle. I'm also someone who has myself and my family's had a lifelong relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I was born and raised there. And I think when I first started hearing these accounts of, Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism and this deeply problematic phenomenon, I tended to be somewhat skeptical. However, as in my own research, I began to do more and more comparative work that took me to many different Muslim majority and minority settings, literally around the world. I kept time and time again, hearing some version of a story from my local interlocutors that have talked about how, we used to do Islam this way, but then the Saudi money and the Saudi influence started arriving and things began to change. And so, after some time, I just felt compelled to try and get to the bottom of this, as it were, and to try and do a academically based treatment of this whole question of how we should think about what we call in the volume Saudi religious transnationalism. So that's really the heart of the matter, and that's kind of where the idea to do the book came from. So many people along the way have offered advice and support of various kinds. Glancing at the participant list today, I already see that a good number of them are here with us in the audience, and it's great to have you all. We could easily take up the time that we have just by me running through the many thanks and debts of gratitude that the book owes. So. I think in the time that I have remaining, because we are hoping to leave as much time available for discussion as we can, I just thought that I would touch on some of the sort of key points that might be useful for people to understand, to get a handle on the kind of broad phenomenon under analysis here, what we call Saudi religious transnationalism. This activity, dates back to, I think it's fair to say, primarily the 1960s, under the reign of the former Saudi king Faisal, who ruled from 1964 to 1975. And a policy trend that began under Faisal, whereby Saudi Arabia began to use revenues associated with hydrocarbon exports to fund various religious causes, initially in the Middle East, but then in other regions around the world, in the context both of Saudi Arabia's regional geopolitical rivalries and the Cold War more broadly. And there is, I think, a very interesting Cold War story to be told about this. As someone who's an international relations scholar myself, and as a output coming from a project based here at the Berkeley Center that is broadly focused on understanding the various ways that governments incorporate religion into their foreign policy and external relations. I was always interested in thinking about and focusing on the ways in which religious outreach activities could be understood as an element of Saudi statecraft. I think dating back to the time of King Faisal, when we, of course, want to remember that in the Middle East itself, the Saudi Arabia's main rival was Egypt under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the sort of secular nationalist, at times socialist inflected pan-Arabist trend emanating from Cairo. And in order to counter those kinds of influences, Saudi Arabia found religion to be a very useful tool. It's also, and here I think it is important to bring the United States into the picture fairly early on, because during the height of the Cold War, there is considerable evidence to suggest that Saudi Arabia, or that the United States viewed Saudi religious export activity as something that carried considerable geopolitical utility, as a way of offsetting and counterbalancing communist influences emanating from the Soviet Union. And so we certainly saw the United States welcoming Saudi support for religious causes, particularly in a number of countries and settings around the world that were viewed by Washington, D.C. as potentially vulnerable to communist insurrection. So there comes to be a very interesting sort of periodization that it's possible to do with respect to bracketing different phases of what we're calling Saudi religious transnationalism here. One that has a kind of a focus on regional rivals of Saudi Arabia, broadening to a kind of broader Cold War strategy. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution in Iran, much of this activity shifted towards countering what was perceived as increased efforts by Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran under Khomeini, to become more religiously influential in the Middle East and in other Muslim majority settings. And there's all kinds of interesting intervening pathways that emerge, some of which connect to parts of the world that our colleague Alex Thurston focuses on, such as as the growth of Pentecostal and evangelical Christianity in Africa really took off in the 1990s, there were certainly overtures made to the Saudis by Muslim African populations that felt at risk and vulnerable due to the explosive growth of Christianity, and sought support from the Saudis to kind of counterbalance those changing religious demographics in Africa. So many different dimensions to the story, and these different periodizations. I want to touch briefly also on kind of how we should understand and almost typologize the chief channels and mechanisms through which what we call Saudi religious transnationalism has been disseminated around the world. There is, for example, of course, the activities of the Saudi Ministry of Islamic Affairs and Dawah, which has spent considerable sums of money over the years in building mosques around the world, making available in various languages specific religious texts, which are often associated with the building of those mosques, and then schools sometimes connected to those same religious institutions. So there's Saudi government ministry activity here. Also very important has been the role played by a couple of parastatal organizations, namely the World Assembly of Muslim Youth and the Muslim World League. Neither of these are official appendages of the Saudi government, but they are organizations that are either mostly or entirely Saudi funded, and whose broad strategic steer is often understood to come from Riyadh. So, these organizations from the 60s onward played a key role in this story. There's, of course, the International Islamic University in Medina, which was set up specifically in order to provide Islamic higher education to students from around the Muslim majority world, with the university providing very generous scholarships, hundreds of them every year, to students from around the world. And so there's this interesting higher education dimension to be aware of. Then things start to get kind of more complicated when it comes to, for example, the role of Islamic charities, Saudi Islamic charities, in disseminating particular religious influences. I say complicated because until the aftermath of 9/11, much of the transnational activities of Saudi-based Islamic charities were largely invisible to the Saudi state insofar as they were not monitored, they were not regulated, they were not cataloged. And it's only after 9/11 and the kind of broad clampdown on transnational financial flows that took place after that event, that the Saudi state began to kind of look more closely at these charitable flows. And so one of the reasons I think why it's very difficult for anyone to put a reliable, accurate figure on the sheer magnitude of money that's been spent by the Saudis on religious propagation activity is precisely the fact that for several decades, there was no one in Saudi Arabia actually keeping track of or sort of doing the counting, as it were. Other relevant vectors to think of here beyond the charitable sector is, of course, labor migration. As many of you know, in Saudi Arabia, you have a large number of migrant laborers coming from other countries in the Middle East, but also from South Asia and Southeast Asia. And so one thing that we were curious about when putting the project together was the extent to which it might be possible to examine the extent to which conduits of labor migration, and more specifically returning labor migrants, who in some cases might have spent several decades in Saudi Arabia before returning to their home country, to what extent are returning labor migrants a relevant angle at which to get some purchase on this broader question. So we have one case study in the volume focused very specifically on Bangladesh, but even more so and even more precisely focused very narrowly on the question of the extent to which returning migrant laborers from Bangladesh who had spent significant times in Saudi Arabia had an impact on the kind of religious landscape and Islam in Bangladesh more broadly. There's also some interesting questions, I think, to be asked about the Hajj pilgrimage. Obviously, as the country that hosts the annual Hajj pilgrimage, this creates a platform annually for the Saudis every year that gives them the ability to receive an audience of hundreds of thousands, millions of Muslims from around the world, that are, in a sense, a captive audience in Saudi Arabia for a period of time. Materials can be distributed, messages can be offered, and so that Hajj transnational dimension also becomes a relevant one to explain here. I've already touched on the fact that we don't have a lot of accurate and reliable data with respect to the total amount of money spent by the Saudis since this support of religious causes started in the 1960s. And you will find incredibly widely varying ranges offered. And I think the more you understand the nature of the phenomenon, the more it becomes possible to also understand why it's nearly impossible to get any clear sense of what the total amount spent is. One thing that I think we do feel comfortable saying in the aftermath of doing this research is that there's clearly been a downward trend over the last 10 to 15 years in the amount of money that the Saudis have been spending on this kind of activity. A lot of people that I talk to about the book have asked questions about or have kind of straight out asked me, is this book maybe not kind of out of date now because we now have in Saudi Arabia this Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's made it clear that he's going to be putting a stop to this activity. So, is the book even relevant anymore? I would say that it is relevant just because, first of all, we don't have a systematic documentation historically of what this phenomenon has looked like to date. And second, I think in many of the countries that we're talking about, there actually haven't been active tendrils of Saudi religious connectivity, since the 1980s. That said, the intensity of those connections back at that time were such that I think we're still seeing the impact. And in other words, there are many cases where there are important legacy effects of previous Saudi connections from different recent historical periods that need to be understood. But most of all, I'm grateful with respect to this question that Anel is here to offer her own expertise, because I know that she has been looking and thinking about the question of how we should think about Saudi religious transnationalism in the age of Mohammed bin Salman. So when we get to our question and answer and discussion period, I'm happy to kind of talk about some of our findings with respect to the nature and the impact of Saudi religious transnationalism in various settings and some of the cross-cutting findings emerging from the research as a whole. But in the interest of time, I think probably makes best sense to move on to our other speakers now. Anel, thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Peter. Now I'll pass the mic over to Alex.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and really appreciate Peter for hosting me at this event and for inviting me to contribute to the volume. I really learned a tremendous amount through the workshops that were the author workshops that were associated with the project, and through reading the other chapters and listening to Peter's insights. It was a really exciting project to be a part of, and thanks also to Anel for hosting, and thanks for the Berkeley Center for hosting all of us. Yeah, so I'll dive into my chapter and my thinking about Wahhabism/Salafism in the Sahel, and I may make reference to Nigeria as well. In terms of the picture that Wahhabi or Salafi influences encountered in the 20th century and 21st century, I mean, the kind of classical model of Islam in Northwest Africa has rested on three planks: the Maliki madhab or school of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, the Ash'ari school of Sunni theology, and then the Sufi orders, such as the Tijaniya and the Qadiriyya and so forth. So those three elements, especially in combination, were often the core identity of scholars in the region, and to some extent, had a great impact on ordinary people. But there were still challenges to that model from time to time, especially from the 1930s on, and Wahhabism, Salafism, Reformism, various currents became part of challenging that traditional model. I should say that the term Wahhabism obviously is contested around the world. It's contested as well in the Sahel. So the term Wahhabism has often been used, almost always, by outsiders describing oftentimes their enemies. It's been used more often as an epithet than as a self-descriptor. There's also been a lot of movements in the region that have been labeled Wahhabi by outsiders that don't necessarily fit everything that one might associate with Wahhabism or Salafism. So there's been substantial currents of anti-Sufism in the region, especially from the 1930s or 40s on. There's been reformist movements, but not all of those movements, even if they've been labeled Wahhabi or Salafi from the outside, they haven't necessarily all subscribed to the full package of Salafi identity. And then two, I should say that Sufism itself in the region is dynamic as well. So there have been, reform movements within Sufi orders, in various places. The most famous West African Sufi reformer of the 20th century would be the Senegalese Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, but there are many other Sufi reformers of the period. I should also say that, any kind of label that one might apply to Wahhabis or to Salafis is also contested. To call people Sunnis or Sunnites, that too has become a contested label. When people call themselves Ahl Sunnah, they're challenging other factions' claims to that label as well. And there's been, in a sense, like a backlash against some of this terminological struggle. There are, substantial minorities of people in the region who identify as just Muslim, and who are sort of exhausted by some of the terminological debates and the different attempts to claim various labels. Looking at the influence of Saudi Arabia in the region, I think this tracks, identically almost with what Peter was saying. There were definitely connections between the Sahel region and Saudi Arabia prior to the rule of King Faisal. One prominent example of that would be the Mauritanian scholar Mohammed Al-Amin Al-Shinqiti, who went to Saudi Arabia in the late 40s and became a pillar, actually, of the religious establishment inside Saudi Arabia. But definitely, when looking at kind of mass Saudi influence in the Sahel, this is usually looking at the 60s on. So King Faisal came personally to several Sahelian countries, especially on a tour of the region in 1972. There was a substantial influence of the Islamic University of Medina, of the Muslim World League, the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, and other institutions that Peter mentioned. And in a way, one could say that the Sahel was particularly kind of open to outside influence, in part because it's effectively the poorest region in the world. I mean, oftentimes the Sahel has been at the bottom of the Human Development Index, maybe with the slight exception of Mauritania, which does better than the other countries economically. And then also, as Peter was alluding to, the 1980s, maybe the 1990s as well, were arguably the peak of Saudi influence in the region. So, these seemed, anecdotally at least, these seem to be the decades that witnessed the bitterest debates over, how to pray, over very harsh and exclusivist language, sometimes even from figures I think of as mainstream Salafis, effectively, getting very close to pronouncing kind of takfir almost against Sufis in parts of the region. But after that, then there seems to be some exhaustion that set in, people just getting tired of debates. Also, Salafis and Sufis, for that matter, finding that they needed political allies on the other side, or just the changing life circumstances, compelled people or encouraged people to soften their stances. Definitely, in the region, one can still find very, very harsh polemics, anti-Sufi polemics, and so forth. And there are still the legacy effects that Peter pointed out. I mean, some people whose careers began in the 1980s or the 1990s are still extremely visible. But even some of those figures sometimes have softened a little bit. I mean, one prominent example of that is Mahmoud Dicko in Mali, probably the most famous Malian Salafi, somebody who was known for harsh polemics in the 1980s, but who in recent years has worked very visibly on the political plane with the most prominent Sufi in the country, the Sharif of Nioro du Sahel. So, in a way, he's emblematic of the kind of dynamism that Salafism has had in the region. And I think there's a loose parallel, at least, to be drawn between what Asif Bayat and others have pointed to as a kind of post-Islamism, and then what might be called a sort of post-Salafism in the region. The argument about post-Islamism is that over time with the Islamist model, that frustration set in, that internal contradictions within the Islamist paradigm stood out, and that this led people to look for, political possibilities, ideological possibilities beyond sort of the original Islamist package. I think one could say that this has happened with Salafism as well. And also that at the mass level, some of the, some aspects of Salafism at least are kind of modular. I mean, one can raise one's hands while one prays and pray with one's hands at one's chest, but also wear jeans and a baseball cap. One doesn't have to wear ankle-length trousers. Similarly, one could have a Salafi, or what's called sometimes the Athari theological creed, but then also follow various aspects of the Maliki madhab. I mean, so there's been ways that people can mix and match in the region. And as I was mentioning before, the Malikis, the Sufis, others have not stood still while Salafi influences have spread in the region. There's been adaptation, in particular. I mean, one of the key currencies of Salafism has been the use of hadith, right, and the deployment of hadith as kind of trump cards in debates over how to worship or about just what Islam is. Definitely, the Malikis and the Sufis have responded to that by oftentimes bringing hadiths of their own, or challenging the way that Salafis use hadiths. So there's a lot of dynamism in the region on all sides. Another thing I should say is that particularly in the last couple of decades, but also going back in some cases very far, there are other transnational poles of Islamic authority in the region. So Al-Azhar University in Cairo is a key hub for Sufis in the region. The International University of Africa in Sudan has been a destination for some thinkers within the region. Morocco and Algeria, especially in the last decade or so, have had their own initiatives trying to recruit Sahelian ulama into their kind of political religious projects. And then, further afield, there's Turkey, there's also Malaysia. So there's a very kind of complicated mix of Islamic models out there, and a lot of governments and institutions competing to define Islam, including in terms of their outreach to the Sahel. Maybe just to close with a little bit on the question of jihadism and violence. Definitely there's been a lot of accusations that Saudi influence or Wahhabi influence from the 1980s on kind of prepared the ground for all of these security challenges that one sees in the region today. So the mosaic of jihadist groups in Mali, the Boko Haram phenomenon in Islamic State West Africa province in northeastern Nigeria. Some commentators will link that back to Saudi influence and say basically kind of radical preachers set the stage for all this. I think that's a very simplistic argument, and for one thing, it ignores that some mainstream Salafi figures have literally placed their lives on the line to try to refute and push back against jihadist arguments. And then also, as Peter was saying, I mean, just on a factual level, it's really, really hard to establish, what kind of funding was going where. Northern Mali, for example, during the 1990s, there was not a tremendous amount of access for researchers and so forth. There's been some really interesting work by, Baz Lecoq and David Gutelius and others about this, but still the picture of even what was going on, with charities and so forth is still very, very murky. And then when we look at jihadist mobilization in the region, it's not just some sort of product of ideological radicalization. There's all sorts of other factors, many of which appear to me to be more dominant than the ideological one. Internal tensions within different communities and ethnic groups, and in particular a kind of revolt of social juniors against the established order. There's a severe crisis of pastoralism in the region, and pastoralists have become key recruits for some of the violent and militant groups. There's been a backlash against government corruption and perceived local oligarchies. There's been a hardening of ethnic identity in different regions. There's also been, a certain amount of fluidity in terms of which armed groups, including non-jihadist armed groups, are fighting which others and who's aligned with whom. And there seems to be a lot of logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, particularly in northern Mali and the Sahel. So all that to say that certainly, some very stripped down version of the Salafi/Wahhabi creed is part of jihadism, but there's also a lot more going on in terms of political factors, social factors, and so forth. So attributing the jihadist mobilization to Saudi influence, I think would be very one-dimensional. So I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Alex. So interesting. I know we'll be able to get to questions about that. So I'm just going to speak briefly before we start addressing questions, although I know Peter's also addressing some questions in the chat box for folks, but just really quickly wanted to talk a little bit about how things have changed a little bit in recent years under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, specifically thinking about his announcement back in fall of 2017 that Saudi Arabia would return to moderate Islam. And then this question being that, what he meant by that was a shift in a lot of social mores having to do with gender segregation, for example. There's been a lot of emphasis on that, in addition to opening institutions like cinemas, for example. People are probably broadly familiar with the ways that MBS and King Salman have been changing sort of what is it like to exist in Saudi society these days, and how are they squaring those shifts with the fact that for quite a long time, the way that Saudi Islam was defined and sort of embodied by Saudis or by people visiting Saudi, a lot of emphasis was placed on these things like strict gender segregation. And so the notion now that the Saudi state is saying, oh, those issues are actually marginal, or that's not really what's so important. And before the idea being that, well, no, this is really central to our understanding of Islam, it's understandably, I think, both for Saudis themselves as well as for Muslims around the world, or simply observers around the world who had looked to Saudi Arabia as kind of this paragon of an extremely conservative, perhaps people have used the word orthodox, or the notion of orthopraxy, kind of the practice of Islam, and sort of the most stringent interpretation. If that's no longer coming from Saudi Arabia, or if Saudi Arabia is redefining what it means, essentially they're trying to still say, yes, we remain this source of religious authority, but we're not going to manifest it through these practices that historically we had held up as kind of evidence of why Saudi Arabia should be this model that other Muslims should look to. And so the last time I was able to be in Saudi Arabia was in early 2019, and was able to interview, for example, the Minister of Religious Affairs and Dawah, and asked him, did he have any thoughts on the fact that Saudi Arabia was in fact shifting some of this discourse about what Saudi Islam really meant, and was he at all concerned that this might throw people off, or that Saudi Arabia could even lose perhaps some of its religious authority? And understandably, he's speaking to a researcher. We're surrounded by observers. He needed to, the response he gave needed to reflect the official line clearly. But he also, I remember his response was interesting, because he said, well, everyone still faces Saudi Arabia, faces Mecca 5 times a day. Like, clearly we are still the center of people's experience. Their bodily experience of Islam is to face Saudi Arabia. And so perhaps he may have private thoughts that differ from that, but at least his official position and that of the Saudi state seems to be that the Al Saud can change the framework and the narrative around what Islam means, how Saudi Arabia defines sort of this correct Islam, and that this will not undermine their status as this source of religious authority around the world. But that for me remains a very interesting question, especially based on some of my field work elsewhere around the region, especially Jordan, for example, where I know a lot of people would look to Saudi Arabia and wouldn't necessarily look to religious figures in Jordan itself not having something like Al-Azhar or another sort of august institution of religious authority. And so for Jordanians and for many people around the world, they would look to Saudi clerics, often these sort of TV clerics, not necessarily members of the religious establishment, but affiliated with and that operated with the blessing of the Saudi government. And the question now sort of being, if Saudi religious authority has been undermined, are there figures or countries that are going to be able to step into that, or to try to usurp some of this Saudi religious authority, perhaps by reasserting this more conservative interpretation? Or on the other hand, and Peter spoke to this a little bit as well, this notion of sort of the periodization of how, and my research in particular looks at this question of how after 9/11, it was very important, this question of kind of who speaks for Islam, and what are we talking about, and what is this notion of so-called moderate Islam. And this was then reiterated after the Arab Spring, as Islamist groups were able to take power in a few countries, or to share power in some contexts. And then a question, of how were these existing religious institutions grappling with this competition for authority from Islamist groups. And then also in the context of Daesh, of the Islamic State, it again was very important who exactly is speaking for Islam. Is it Daesh? Most sources of official religious authority rejected Daesh and said that that's not Islam. But in many ways, as was frequently pointed out in media, much of what the Saudi state was in fact reflected in texts that Daesh was using, their educational textbooks, for example, And so the question now is, does this remain as salient? Obviously, in the context of COVID and just general economic woes that have followed as a result of the pandemic, is this question of where is religious authority coming from? Is it as salient as it was in these sort of recent history when we saw very much different countries competing with each other for this religious authority? And then again, even if perhaps it is not quite as salient as it was during the prominence of Daesh, for example, does that offer an opportunity for other countries to perhaps try to come in again and compete with Saudi Arabia? I think, for example, the Emirates have done a lot of work in trying to sort of promote themselves, if not necessarily to fellow Muslims, but to non-Muslims as sort of this source of tolerant Islam and moderate Islam, doing things like hosting the Pope and just promoting their image as this sort of alternative interpretation, which again is not really aimed at Muslims per se. And then we see MBS perhaps trying to do that as well, but knowing that Saudi Arabia has a very different history there, and that they also, that the Muslims of the world continue to look to Saudi Arabia for guidance. So I will stop talking and happy to get into more specific questions. But now I'll go to the Q&A, but then also wanted to invite either Peter or Alex, if they already had their eye on a question that they wanted to answer, please go ahead.
Thanks, Anel. There are such a fantastic range of diverse questions in the Q&A box, and thank you all. I mean, this could easily be a 3-hour session, I think. Just a couple of brief thoughts that will try to respond to at least part of a couple of these questions. Just in terms of how we should understand the Mohammed bin Salman side of things that you just mentioned, my own understanding and analysis accords very closely with your own. My sense is that at the end of the day, this man is a pragmatist. So I don't think that he personally has much in the way of, let's call it, an ideological investment in Wahhabism or Salafism or its promotion. And I think that he sees plenty of utility for his broader strategic goals in pulling back some of this activity, both domestically in Saudi Arabia itself, with respect to steps he's taken vis-a-vis the religious police, but also in kind of terms of the international side of things, where, through, as you mentioned, parastatal groups like the Muslim World League, the kinds of ideas and messages you hear coming out of the Muslim World League today about the dangers of anti-Semitism, and its Secretary General, handpicked by Mohammed bin Salman, we might add, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed Al-Isa, visiting Auschwitz. These kinds of things are just head spinning for anyone who has been studying in the Muslim World League for any period of time, because it's very different from the kinds of things you heard coming out of that organization years back. That said, given that he's a pragmatist, I also think that when he senses geopolitical utility in external efforts to deploy religion, if they are seen to be in the interest of Saudi Arabia, he won't hesitate to do so. And I think we actually see some evidence of this today vis-a-vis Iran, insofar as those scholars associated with the Saudi religious establishment seem to still have broad license to engage in various forms of anti-Shi'i rhetoric. I think, therefore, with a broad understanding of Shi'ism equals Iran. And so I do think that we continue to see some sort of active deployment of religion in Saudi Arabia's regional strategies vis-a-vis Iran. A lot of questions and curiosity, understandably, about this whole argument that Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism has is a driver of violent extremism and terrorism, and that individuals who come to be socialized into Islam via conduits and channels or institutions or imams at institutions funded by the Saudis have a higher propensity to engage in violent activities. This was certainly a question we were greatly interested in trying to get a handle on. It is so difficult, however, to identify clear linear causality between the behavior of a given individual and their exposure to religion that has some connection to Saudi Arabia. The one clear pattern that I think does come out through the research we did is that when Saudi religious influences enter community and social contexts in which there are already pre-existing religious divisions and cleavages, perhaps sectarian in nature, it has the effect of sharpening and exacerbating those differences. In some cases in South Asia, for example, I think it's fair to say acting as a catalyst to increased socio-political tension, social conflict, including in some cases, violent conflict. Finally, the one thing that I would want to add, just in terms of, and this gets to a few of the questions that have been asked, the thing that I was most surprised about when we kind of tucked into this research, or the aspect of it that I had not been anticipating, is the extent to which it's questionable whether the religious influences on the receiving end of any given dyad are necessarily, or are still Saudi in nature by the time they get where they're going. And what I mean by this is that there are so many third-party entities and mediators that are part of that journey of transmission, from funding that originates in Saudi Arabia, or a decision to build a mosque that is taken in a room somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and eventually some months or years later, a mosque is built, or a school is built, or some texts are transitioned. But when it comes to these parastatal organizations like the Muslim World League and the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, now, while Saudi Arabia, as we know, is not right now presently much of a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, the Saudis were only too happy to essentially staff the upper echelons of these parastatal organizations with members and affiliates of the Muslim Brotherhood, of that sort of Ikhwanist trend more broadly in the 1970s and 80s. And so in many cases, what we're talking about are Saudi religious impulses that are then operationalized and implemented via networks that are Muslim Brotherhood controlled. And then we haven't even added in the kind of complex processes that occur in the destination country, where local communities actually often have more agency than is commonly realized in terms of reshaping external religious influences such that they better suit indigenous religious culture, if I can put it that way. In other words, this idea, as I often put it, of a sort of Wahhabi wrecking ball that comes crashing through these supposedly pristine, localized religious cultures just doesn't really hold up to the social reality of what happens in these inevitably far more complex processes of transnational dissemination and adaptation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Peter. We are starting to run a little low on time. There are several questions having to do with Sufism, and so I hoped maybe Alex could weigh in and speak a little bit to that, because it does seem that there's some interest there. One, for example, having to do with the reign of King Faisal, as well as just sort of others. Alex, I leave it to you if there are specific questions you wanted to respond to.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I mean, I think the way that Peter just laid out the mechanisms, I mean, I think it's probably the most sophisticated way I've heard it laid out. I mean, and I think that's one of the difficult challenges of this is that there are so many different moving parts. I mean, and I think that comes out in some of the questions too. I mean, Wahhabism, Salafism, whatever one wants to call it, is not a static thing in and of itself, right? The Saudi state is not a static thing. The host countries, or whatever one wants to call them, or the recipient countries, are not static either. Yeah, and I think that the question about from Ramazan about Sufis, I think it's an excellent point, and I think it can all be true. I mean, you know, if you look at the different, you know, advisory boards for the Islamic University of Medina and so forth, I mean, definitely there were, you know, or the Muslim World League, I mean, there were scholars and members who went well beyond what would narrowly be considered, you know, Salafi. But it can also be a period of Wahhabi outreach at the same time. I mean, that can sort of all be true at once. And I think, yeah, it was a very complicated picture. In terms of, yeah, other questions having to do with Sufism. Okay, so there's the question from Roberta Miller about is the variety of active beliefs and practices within Wahhabism or Sufism, et cetera, really an aspect of cultural foundations in specific regions as to what is proper? I think, you know, on the whole, I would lean toward saying no on that, actually. I mean, I think that, you know, there's been, particularly with Africa, right, there's been the idea that there's a kind of African Islam, right, which is really just sort of like a veneer of Islam over sort of pre-existing, you know, African religiosity. I think that, to me, I think that you know, misses a lot of what's going on. I mean, first of all, right, it's sort of questioning the sincerity of people's Islam, and then I think, you know, also Sufism. I mean, Sufism in a way has been one of the most effective vectors for the spread of Islam, but I think in a way not just kind of you know, allowing people to smuggle their pre-existing kind of cultural traditions into Islam, but, you know, Sufism has a tremendously deep intellectual apparatus, and one finds the same Sufi orders in different parts of the world, even in very different kinds of cultures and so forth. And so I think, you know, Sufism, I mean, a really, really complicated phenomenon, and I think more than kind of a expression of local culture, if that makes sense. What else? I think, you know, those were some of the questions. Yeah, so it's Ali's question, I mean, about Salafism emanating from other parts of the world, like from South Asia and so forth. That's an excellent question too. I mean, to me, like the view from West Africa, I would say is no. I mean, I haven't seen a lot of direct South Asian influence there. And when one talks about kind of Salafi influence, it would appear to be coming either from Saudi Arabia or maybe from different versions of Salafism coming from North Africa. So yeah, I think this is a good point. I mean, about the multipolarity of Salafism and where it, yeah, how one receives Salafism depends very much on where one sits. Yeah, I think those are some of the questions that occurred, or the answers that occurred to me. Oh, I guess I'll take, because this has come up a couple of times. I mean, Peter gave a much more sophisticated answer to this question of what is the difference between Wahhabism and Salafism. My shorthand for that, though, is that, you know, same creed, same literalist theological creed, but I think of Wahhabism as still following the Hanbali madhab, where I think of Salafism as being sort of skepticism or even outright dismissal of all the madhabs. I guess that's the way I make the distinction in a sort of a simplistic way. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Have a few more minutes here to try to get to a lot of these really great questions. I think one in particular, I don't know if Peter would be able to weigh in. We also definitely had some questions on more practices in South Asia or elsewhere in Asia. I know chapters in the book focus on this. Peter, if you're able to speak to some of those.
Yeah, no, sure, absolutely. And Anel, I hope you also won't hold back on answering any of the questions that are of interest to you. Yeah, the question about how to think of South Asia and all of this is very complicated, because people often will kind of draw parallels between Wahhabism and the religious orientation of the Taliban and ask whether there are Saudi influences on the Taliban. You know, the Taliban are Deobandis, which means that in terms of their jurisprudential orientation, they're Hanafis, but, you know, Hanafism is a vast church, if I can put it that way, that whose actual specific positions legally on issues vary widely from context to context. And there is in South Asia, of course, you know, an indigenous form of Salafism known as the Ahl al-Hadith movement. And certainly the adherents to the Ahl al-Hadith movement have certainly cooperated and very easily made common cause and built networks and connections with the Saudi religious establishment over the years. With respect to the question of how we should think about Saudi influence on the Taliban, however, I think the real answer to that lies in much more complicated terrain that involves looking at religious schools in Pakistan that were funded by Saudi Arabia, certainly, but also supported in varying and, let's say, highly complicated ways by the Pakistani intelligence services in the years running up to the emergence of the Taliban as an active political and militant movement. So I don't think you can understand the rise of the Taliban, including its religious orientation, simply by tracing connections back to Saudi Arabia, because the kind of the Pakistani milieu in which the movement incubated and the role of the Pakistani military and intelligence services in facilitating that, I think, is vitally important.
Thanks, Peter. I was trying to respond to also a couple questions via text. So we are really coming down to the end here, and I hate to have missed anyone's question. I wanted to just weigh in once more about sort of this overarching question, perhaps for Peter and for Alex, of this notion of where do we think religious soft power is headed? Do we see it as continuing to come from Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that they are kind of changing the parameters of what exactly that means and what they used to say, you know, this is why we have such religious authority because we adhere so strictly. And now they're saying we still have this authority, but we're no longer adhering quite as strictly. Do you anticipate that Saudi Arabia will continue to sort of be this source of authority, or, you know, for your next big edited volume, Peter, will you need to focus on perhaps another country that's, you know, whether it's Turkey, Iran, Indonesia, other competitors for this mantle of sort of a center of global Islamic authority?
Well, as it happens, Anel, the next book absolutely does go global in terms of this question of religious soft power. And I really have to thank and credit Hilary Wiesner from Carnegie, who I think is in the audience today, for kind of pulling me back from my narrow obsession with Saudi Arabia and kind of saying, Peter, come on, there's a whole global story to be told about religious soft power. And you need to like focus on the fact that Russia and India and Brazil and China and the United States are in this game as well. And so the next book coming out, also with Oxford University Press, I think probably early next year, is called The Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power, how states use religion in foreign policy. And it's trying to kind of capture and pick up on a global trend of any number of great and emerging powers incorporating religion in varying and widely ways in their external relations. I of late have been particularly interested in how Russia has been doing this, not just vis-a-vis Ukraine, and have been doing a little bit of writing on that, but also in the Western Balkans more broadly. And so one thing that's next up for the Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power project is to kind of look in some detail at how Vladimir Putin's close alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church is an increasingly persistent and consistent aspect of Russian statecraft.
Very much looking forward to that new project, especially now. I believe we are almost out of time, but I did want to give Alex one more chance to weigh in with any final thoughts, whether on this question of alternative sources of specifically Muslim religious authority, or any other concluding thoughts he wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, you know, in terms of where things might be headed, I mean, you know, just to kind of emphasize a couple points I was making earlier. I mean, I think that there is, you know, this interesting phenomenon of people saying I'm just Muslim, right? I'm sort of exhausted by all of these debates, and I just, you know, I don't want to label. And I think that position may grow in popularity. I think that there's, you know, also this modularity that I was talking about, where one can pick and choose a little bit, right? You can pick and choose the elements of Salafism, Sufism, you know, Malikism, et cetera, that one likes, and craft a kind of hybrid identity for oneself. And then I think, you know, one interesting trend in the world, and maybe this gets to the question about other sources of religious influence, is neo-traditionalists, right? And people who say, you know, the whole Sunni scholarly tradition, which Salafis have often dismissed, you know, or a lot of it they've dismissed, you know, but the neo-traditionalists saying, this has a lot of value, this can answer all of your questions now, you know, okay, maybe I have a madhab, but I'm not super strongly attached to it. I'll borrow from other madhahib as I choose. I mean, that's a really appealing kind of perspective. And I think, you know, the kind of, you know, neo-Maliki perspectives coming out of, you know, Morocco and elsewhere are I think appealing to some people. I think especially figures who really dial down the you know, kind of sectarianism or the polemics and so forth. So, you know, but those figures too have often been kind of influenced by Salafism, but in a subtle way. So the Salafi influence, I think, persists, but in a modified form in some neo-traditionalist circles. Yeah, there's more to say, but for the sake of time, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alex. And I think just one thing I did want to make sure we say here, there were some questions about this notion of Wahhabism and terrorism. And I just wanted to quote something that Peter has said multiple times, which I find very useful, which is that there are as many types of Islam as there are Muslims. And so it is not useful. And I know obviously since 9/11, we've all been living in this very sort of Islamophobic context that unfortunately has not really lifted, despite the vast amount of scholarship and attention that has gone into trying to better understand some of these different strains of religious authority and where people's beliefs come from. But just to, unfortunately, it's 2022 and we still have to reiterate that trying to sort of establish a causal link between violence and religion is really not a fruitful enterprise. But I do want to thank both Peter and Alex for what I consider a very fruitful intellectual enterprise, this wonderful book, and to thank everyone for their attention and for their great questions. And if your question didn't get answered, you know, please feel free to reach out to the panelists to get it answered directly. So many thanks again to Peter and to Alex and to the other co-authors of this great edited volume, to the Berkeley Center, and to all of you for joining us.